Tonight we pull back the curtain on a mystery hidden in plain sight. Everyone knows the man in white, the Pope, the smiling figure on balconies, blessing crowds and kissing babies. But few have heard of the one who stands in the shadows, the man they call the Black Pope. He does not wear a crown. He does not give speeches. And yet some believe he holds more power than any pope in history. Not just over the church, over governments, over knowledge, over time itself. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about control. Silent authority passed through unseen hands. From ancient missions across continents to vaults beneath the Vatican, where truth is kept behind locked doors. They say the Jesuits are just teachers, just scholars. But what if they were something more? Architects of memory, engineers of obedience. And what if the Superior General, the Black Pope, was the true keyholder to Rome? Tonight we follow the trail through centuries of erased names, vanished books, forbidden oaths, and a power structure hidden behind the throne. And those who have tried to expose it, they are either discredited or disappeared. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because once we step into the shadows of the Vatican, you may never see the Church the same way again. They say the Pope is the most powerful man in the world. He stands in white robes on marble balconies, waves to crowds, blesses millions, and speaks with the authority of God himself. His face is on stamps. His words move armies. He is called the Holy Father, the Vicar of Christ, the Shepherd of souls. But what if all of that was just the surface? What if the true power of the Vatican was never meant to be seen? The Pope is everywhere and nowhere. He travels the globe, he speaks to nations, he appears calm, smiling, almost fragile. But behind every photo, every procession, every ceremony, something feels strange. How can one man possibly control the largest religious empire on earth, one that spans continents and centuries, with over 1 billion followers and influence in nearly every government? The answer is simple. He doesn't. In the grand halls of the Vatican, beneath the gold ceilings and echoing footsteps, the Pope is both leader and symbol. He signs documents. He gives blessings. But many of the decisions, the real decisions, are made long before his pen touches the page. And many of them are made by people whose names you've never heard. People who never stand on balconies. People who never smile for the cameras. Throughout history, popes have come and gone. Some were kind, some were cruel, some were barely more than puppets. But the system behind them never changed. There has always been a structure within the Church that protects the image of holiness while hiding the machinery that keeps it all running. The image is white, the power is black. From the outside, the Vatican appears peaceful, rituals, candles, hymns. But inside its walls are centuries of secrets, entire archives sealed from the public, rules and hierarchies that even most Catholics do not understand. And at the centre of it all stands a man in white who appears to rule but may simply reign, like a king in a chess game who can only move one square while others move in silence behind him. Who chooses what the Pope says? Who decides which documents he signs? Who advises him before he appears on the world stage? And who watches from the shadows to make sure that everything goes according to plan? This is where the questions begin. Because while the world looks to the Pope as the leader of the Church, there are those who believe he is not its master, but its mask. A face to the faithful, a symbol of purity. A man with light all around him. But every light casts a shadow. And that shadow leads deeper into the heart of Rome, than most are willing to go. What you are about to uncover is not about one man. It is about a structure that has stood for centuries. A structure that smiles with one face while hiding another. A structure where the truth has always been protected, not by light, but by secrecy. And in that secrecy lies the real power, the one they never show you. In every kingdom, there is the ruler you see and the one you never notice. History remembers the faces on coins and statues, but real power has always preferred the shadows. And in the case of the Vatican, those shadows lead to a man almost no one has ever heard of. They call him the Black Pope. He does not wear a crown. He does not wave from balconies. Most people could pass him in the street and never know who he is. Yet some believe he holds more influence than the Pope himself, not by speaking loudly, but by never needing to speak at all. The title Black Pope does not mean evil or dark magic. It means hidden, silent, operating behind the curtain. His real name is the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, the leader of the Jesuit order. An order so powerful, so deeply embedded in the Church, that its members have been called soldiers of God, and their general is no ordinary priest. For over 400 years, the Superior General has commanded the most loyal and most mysterious branch of the Catholic Church. Jesuits take a vow of obedience, so absolute they are trained to act without hesitation. And at the top of that chain stands one man, the Black Pope. He answers to no bishop. He does not ask for permission. Even the real Pope, the one in white, is not technically above him in the Jesuit chain of command. The idea sounds impossible. How can there be a second Pope? One that no one elected. One that the public never sees. But that is exactly the point. The greatest power is the kind no one notices. No cameras, no ceremonies, just decisions made behind closed doors, policies whispered into the right ears, and a network so vast it stretches from Rome to every corner of the world. The Black Pope is not listed in your history books. He is not mentioned in sermons, but dig a little deeper, and his presence is everywhere. In universities, in courts, in political offices, in the shaping of minds and the rewriting of stories, the Jesuits have been advisors to kings, confessors to generals, educators of presidents, and always, quietly, they report to one man. Some say the Black Pope is just a title, a figurehead, but others believe he is the real architect of the modern church. That while the Pope blesses crowds and kisses babies, the Black Pope watches from behind the curtain, guiding events with precision and purpose. Is this just a legend? A conspiracy born from centuries of mystery? Or is it the oldest open secret in the Church? No one knows exactly how far the Black Pope's influence reaches, and perhaps that is by design, because the deeper you search, the more invisible he becomes. And yet, in every echo of history, where power shifts in silence, where knowledge disappears, and where obedience spreads without question, his fingerprints remain. And that silence might be the loudest message of all. They were not monks. They were not priests in dusty robes, reading scripture in silence. The Jesuits were something else entirely. When they appeared in the 1500s, they moved like no other religious order before them. They travelled fast. They learned languages. They studied science, philosophy, politics. And they were trained not just to pray, but to think, to teach, and when needed, to act. The year was 1540. Europe was in chaos. The Catholic Church was losing its grip. People were beginning to question the old ways. The Protestant Reformation had already split the Christian world in two. Faith was cracking. Power was slipping. And in the middle of this storm, one man appeared with a plan to take it all back. His name was Ignatius of Loyola. He had once been a soldier, not a holy man, a warrior with a sword, a uniform, and a dream of glory. But after a battlefield injury left him bedridden for months, something inside him changed. He started reading religious texts, imagining saints as soldiers in a divine war, and when he rose from that bed, he believed he had found his new mission, not to fight on the battlefield, but to fight for the soul of the Church. Ignatius gathered a small group of followers. They were well-educated, multilingual, and fiercely loyal. They called themselves the Society of Jesus, but the world came to know them by a different name, the Jesuits. Their motto was simple: for the greater glory of God. But what that meant in practice was anything but simple. Jesuits became the Vatican's most trusted agents. They were teachers, scholars, confessors, diplomats, and sometimes spies. Wherever the Church needed to regain control, the Jesuits were sent, and they did not fail. They travelled across continents, to Asia, to Africa, to the Americas. They built schools, founded missions, advised kings, taught philosophy in elite universities, and always they reported back to their superior general, the man who stood at the centre of their web, the Black Pope. But what made them different was not just their reach, it was their method. Jesuits were trained with military precision. They were taught to obey without question, to adapt to any culture, to blend in, and to reshape the world from the inside. To some, they were heroes of faith. To others, they were manipulators in cassocks. Even Catholic monarchs grew suspicious. At one point, the Jesuits became so powerful they were banned from entire countries. But like shadows, they returned. They always return. The Jesuits were not built to be popular. They were built to last, to hold knowledge, to shape belief, and to guard the Church from the inside out, not with swords or sermons, but with strategy. And that strategy has worked for almost 500 years. But the real question is this: what was their mission really about? Saving the Church, or quietly taking control of it from within? Before he was a saint, he was a soldier, not a saint in training or a holy man waiting for a calling. Ignatius of Loyola was a proud young warrior, obsessed with honour, glory, and the thrill of battle. He carried a sword, wore polished armour, and dreamed of becoming a legend on the battlefield. But fate had other plans, and that twist of fate would shape the most powerful religious order the world has ever known. In 1521, during a battle against the French at a fortress called Pamplona, Ignatius was struck by a cannonball. It shattered his leg and nearly killed him. He was taken back to his family's castle, not in victory, but broken and humiliated. And it was there, in bed, surrounded by silence, that everything changed. There were no war stories to read, no books about knights or heroes, only religious texts, lives of saints, the Bible, books about sacrifice and inner strength. And as he read, something shifted. He began to imagine the saints not as soft figures in stained glass windows, but as spiritual warriors, men who had fought battles of the soul. He began to believe there was another kind of war, one that was just as real, a war for truth, for faith, for the future of the Church. When he finally recovered, he walked away from his old life, but he never left behind the mindset of a soldier. He He traded armor for robes, a sword for scripture. But his mission stayed the same: fight. Not on battlefields of earth, but in the battlefield of the mind. He would fight for God, and soon others would follow. This military spirit shaped everything about the Jesuit order he later founded. Jesuits did not live in silence like monks. They moved, they studied, they trained. Their obedience to their leader was total. They swore to go wherever the Pope sent them, to serve without hesitation, to die if necessary, and to infiltrate any place where the Church was threatened. Ignatius created a strict system of formation, years of study, discipline, physical and mental tests. Only the strongest minds and most loyal hearts made it through. Jesuits were expected to be sharp, educated, and unshakable. They were not just men of prayer, they were spiritual commandos. Even their leadership reflected a military chain of command. At the top stood the superior general. He was not elected by the public, he served for life. And once chosen, every Jesuit answered to him directly, like a general to his troops. The Pope gave the blessing, but the Black Pope gave the orders. It all started with a cannonball, a moment that shattered the body but awakened the mind. And from that broken soldier rose a new kind of warrior, one who would build an invisible army that would stretch across the world, not by force, but by strategy, by knowledge, by silence. And it all began with one wounded man who decided to turn pain into purpose and war into worship. Most religious orders live by peace. They wear simple robes, they chant in stone chapels, they grow gardens, they copy scripture, they avoid the world and wait for heaven. But the Jesuits were never meant for that kind of life. From the moment they were founded, they were something entirely different. Not silent monks in cloisters, but warriors in disguise. Not just praying for the world, but moving inside it, and sometimes moving it. While other orders sought isolation, the Jesuits sought influence. They did not hide from cities, they entered them. They walked into royal courts, universities, laboratories, and lecture halls. They studied law, philosophy, politics, astronomy, languages. They became the most educated men in Europe, but their mission was never just about learning, it was about power. The kind that does not come from weapons, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how a mind works. Their rules were unlike any other. Jesuits were trained for years before they could even call themselves members, and even then, they were expected to obey without question. If the superior general told them to go to the ends of the earth, they went. If he told them to remain silent, they did. Total obedience, absolute discipline, and loyalty to a single master, the Black Pope. Secrecy was built into their bones. Jesuits kept their missions private, their methods hidden. They did not boast. They did not write long public confessions. Instead, they worked behind the scenes. Their success was measured not in prayers, but in influence. Were they advising the king, teaching the next generation of rulers, helping shape the laws of an empire? Then their mission was working. Even the other orders viewed them with suspicion. The Benedictines stayed in monasteries, the Franciscans served the poor, but the Jesuits operated like an invisible government inside the church. They could be anywhere, and they often were. At times, they were more feared than loved. Rumours spread that they had their own network, their own secrets, even their own code. But the truth is more complex. They were not villains. They were not saints either. They were strategic, calculated. Every step had a purpose. Every silence meant something. They believed the Catholic Church was under attack, and they would do whatever it took to defend it, convert, persuade, educate, and when needed, infiltrate. That is why they were banned in more than one country. Kings feared them, governments expelled them, but they always returned because they were never just a group of priests. They were an order built like an army, and their battlefield was everywhere. To this day, no other order has operated with such reach or such discipline. They did not follow the path of tradition, they made their own, and in doing so, they became something new. A religious order without borders. A brotherhood of intellect and obedience. A different kind of army for a different kind of war. And they have never stopped marching. Most people know that priests take vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. These are the basic three. Give up money, give up marriage, obey your superiors. But the Jesuits take something more. A secret vow. A fourth vow. One that sets them apart from every other religious order. One that binds them to something much deeper than tradition. A vow to obey the Pope, not just in spirit, not just in belief, but in action, in total and unquestioning loyalty. The fourth vow is not taken by every Jesuit, only by those who rise to the highest ranks, only by those who have proven they can be trusted with the Church's most important missions. And when they take it, it is not done in public. There are no grand ceremonies, no applause, just a quiet moment, a sacred promise, and the words are clear: go where the Pope commands, do what the Pope orders, no hesitation, no refusal. But what does that really mean? It means if the Pope sends you to the other side of the world, you go. If he tells you to enter a royal court, you enter. If he asks you to defend the Church in secret, you do it, without asking why, without needing proof. You do not question the mission, you fulfill it. This vow turns the Jesuits into something more than just religious men. It turns them into instruments of the papacy. For centuries, this vow gave the Vatican something no other group could offer: a loyal force that would act instantly, quietly, globally. While other orders focused on prayer or service, the Jesuits became the Pope's invisible hands. They reached places no cardinal could. They influenced kings, educated rulers, redirected entire cultures, and always in the name of obedience. But this kind of power comes with risk. When a group swears absolute loyalty to one man, they can become more powerful than anyone expected. And if that man behind the scenes is not just the Pope in white, but the Black Pope leading the Jesuits, the lines begin to blur. Who is giving the order? Who is really in control? There have been moments in history when the Pope and the Jesuits did not agree. Times when the Jesuits grew too powerful, too independent, and yet the fourth vow remained, at least on paper. The vow that said, above all else, serve the papacy, defend it, protect it, even if it meant shaping the world without anyone ever knowing. Some believe the fourth vow is a symbol of devotion. Others see it as a doorway to silent control. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. The Jesuits were never meant to sit still. They were built to move. And the fourth vow made sure they moved with purpose. Purpose decided not by God directly, but by the man who claims to speak for him. In that vow lies the heart of the mystery. Obedience to the Pope. But which one? The one the world sees, or the one who moves in silence behind the scenes? They were called missionaries, men of God sent to far-off lands to preach the gospel. But the places they went and the roles they played tell a more complicated story. The Jesuits travelled farther than any religious order in history. They went to China, Japan, India, the Middle East, Africa, and deep into the Americas. But they did not just carry crosses and Bibles. They carried knowledge. They observed everything, and they reported back. From the moment they were formed, the Jesuits were different. They were trained to be sharp, to listen more than they spoke, to adapt to local customs, to learn new languages quickly, to understand how a society worked before they tried to change it, and most importantly, to never draw too much attention. That made them perfect missionaries, but it also made them perfect spies. Wherever they went, they made detailed reports, not just about religion or local beliefs, but about trade routes, political alliances, geography, military strength, natural resources. The kind of information that kings and popes could use. Information that could shape strategies. And because Jesuits were seen as men of faith, they were welcomed, they were trusted. They moved freely in courts and palaces where no soldier or official could ever enter. In China, they studied astronomy and impressed the emperor with their knowledge of the stars. In Japan, they learned the art of diplomacy and advised powerful warlords. In the Americas, they built missions near native tribes while quietly mapping the land. They were always watching, always recording, always sending letters back to Rome filled with information most governments would kill to have. Some say they were simply being thorough, that as missionaries, they needed to understand the world to better preach to it. Others believe they were building something else, a global network, a web of influence that connected remote villages to the halls of power in Europe, all under the seal of the Vatican. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Jesuits believed in their mission, but they also believed in strategy. And when religion and politics mix, the line between savior and spy gets very thin, especially when you report to a general. The superior general back in Rome received thousands of letters from Jesuits around the world. Updates, maps, descriptions, warnings. It was a stream of global intelligence, unlike anything any other religious group had. And all of it flowed through a single point, the Jesuit headquarters. It is no wonder that over time people began to fear them. They seemed to know too much, move too easily, be everywhere and nowhere, the kind of presence that feels more like a network than a church. Were they missionaries? Without question. Were they also gathering intelligence that shaped empires? That part is harder to deny. And maybe that was always the plan, to blend faith with information, spirit with strategy, and to build an order that could reshape the world one quiet report at a time. They never ruled from thrones. They never wore crowns. Their names were not carved into monuments or sung in public squares. But somehow, the Jesuits found their way into the most powerful rooms on earth. Not as kings or conquerors, but as something far more dangerous. Advisors, confessors, mentors, the quiet voices behind the loud decisions. This was the Jesuit way, to move through the halls of power without ever needing to be seen. It started with trust. Jesuits were known for their intelligence, their discipline, their education. They studied science, law, philosophy, languages. They trained for years before they ever took on a real mission. So when a king or emperor needed a tutor for his son, he chose a Jesuit. When a queen sought a private confessor, she chose a Jesuit. When a government needed help negotiating with foreign powers, they asked the church, and the church sent the Jesuits. One by one they entered royal courts across Europe. France, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Poland. They never asked for titles or land. They did not need them. Influence was their currency, and they spent it well. In some courts, they guided foreign policy. In others, they shaped the education of future rulers. They whispered advice during wars, suggested reforms, helped manage secret deals, always in the name of God, but often with consequences that stretched far beyond the church. At the same time, the Jesuits built schools. Not small rural schools, but elite academies in capital cities. Places where the children of nobles and rising politicians came to learn Latin logic, mathematics, astronomy, but also doctrine, structure, obedience. Many of Europe's future leaders were educated by Jesuits, and many never forgot their teachers. This created something invisible but powerful, a network of loyalty. Former students who trusted their Jesuit mentors, rulers who relied on Jesuit advisors, courts that could not function without Jesuit counsel. The Jesuits never held official office, but they sat close to those who did, like a shadow cabinet operating beside the throne. It worked because they stayed quiet. They did not boast. They did not threaten. They shaped events from the side. Like skilled players moving pieces on a board they never claimed to own. And when suspicion rose and governments pushed back, the Jesuits simply disappeared. Not gone, just waiting. Even outside of Europe, they followed this model. In the Chinese imperial court, in the Mughal palaces of India, in the colonial capitals of South America, they offered knowledge and earned access. And once inside, they became impossible to remove. What made them so effective was not just their skill, it was their mindset. To serve without being seen, to guide without being named. They believed that true power did not come from the spotlight. It came from standing just behind it, in the quiet, in the shadows. And in those shadows the Jesuits built a kind of invisible empire, one not marked on any map, but very real all the same. Before they shaped kings, or whispered in the ears of emperors, the Jesuits shaped something far more important, the human mind. From the beginning, they knew that the real battlefield was not on the land or in the church, it was in the classroom. If you could teach a child what to think, how to think, and what not to think, you could control the future without ever firing a shot. So the Jesuits built schools. Dozens at first, then hundreds. By the 1700s, they were running one of the largest and most respected education systems in the world. And these were not ordinary schools. They were elite academies where the sons of nobles, merchants, and rising politicians came to learn. And what they learned was no accident. The Jesuits taught Latin, Greek, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric. But woven through every subject was a deeper lesson: loyalty to the church, respect for hierarchy, discipline, logic that always pointed back to faith. Their method was strict, precise, and unlike anything Europe had seen. Students were pushed to memorize entire speeches, debate for hours, and master the art of persuasion. Jesuits did not just teach knowledge, they taught how to use it. This training created something powerful. Generations of young men who were sharp, confident, and obedient. They graduated and stepped into roles as diplomats, judges, generals, scholars. And even if they left the Jesuit classroom, the Jesuit ideas stayed with them. The way they spoke, the way they argued, the way they saw the world. It was all shaped by men in black robes who understood exactly what they were doing. Even their enemies admitted it. Protestants accused the Jesuits of brainwashing. Kings feared that students trained by Jesuits would always be loyal to Rome first. But the Jesuits denied nothing. Their goal was to shape minds. minds that could defend the faith with words sharper than swords. What made Jesuit education so powerful was its reach. They were not limited to Italy or Spain. They built schools in France, Germany, Poland, South America, China, India. Wherever they went, the pattern was the same. Build a school, teach the elites, shape the future, quietly, effectively. Their system was so successful that even rival nations began to copy parts of it. Universities modelled their logic courses after Jesuit manuals. Politicians sent their sons to Jesuit academies, even if they secretly disliked the church, because everyone knew that if you wanted the best education, you went to the Jesuits. But this control came at a cost. Students were not taught to question everything. They were taught to question within limits, to reason, but only so far, to explore, but only in approved directions. And that is where the real influence lived, not in what was said, but in what was never allowed to be said. The Jesuits were not just teachers, they were sculptors of thought, masters of the mind. And once a generation is shaped to think a certain way, the world that follows begins to walk a path already chosen. A path laid quietly behind stone walls and wooden desks. A path lit not by curiosity, but by control. In every story about power, there is always a figure behind the curtain, the one who does not speak on stage, but pulls the strings from the shadows. In the story of the Jesuits, that figure has a name, the Superior General, but to most of the world he is known by a different title, the Black Pope. The name does not come from anything evil, it comes from his robes. Unlike the Pope in white who appears before crowds, the Superior General wears black. He does not wave from balconies. He does not smile for cameras. He is not a celebrity. But he controls an order so vast and so loyal that some believe he holds more real power than the Pope himself. When the Jesuit order was founded, it needed a leader. Not just someone to represent them, but someone to command them. Jesuits are trained to obey completely, to go wherever they are sent, to do whatever is required. But that chain of obedience leads to one man, the general. Once chosen, he rules for life. He is elected not by the public or by the Pope, but by the highest-ranking Jesuits in secret meetings. And once he takes the position, he answers to no one but God. The title Superior General sounds like something from the military. That is not a mistake. The Jesuits were built like an army, not one of weapons, but of minds and missions, and the general is their commander. Every Jesuit around the world reports up through the chain, and at the top, sitting in quiet rooms in Rome, is the Black Pope. Very few people outside the church know his name. Fewer still know his face. He is not hidden by force. He is hidden by design. Jesuit power was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be precise, quiet, effective. And the man who guides that power must be the same. Over time, the Superior General became more than just a leader of priests. He became a strategist, a global overseer, a man with access to intelligence, influence, and networks that reached into royal courts, universities, and governments. Some people believe he had the ear of kings. Others believe he gave orders to popes. Whether or not that is true, the fear was real enough. There were times in history when the Jesuits were banned from entire countries, and the reason was always the same. They had become too powerful, too connected, too invisible. But even when they were expelled, the general remained. He continued to lead from Rome. The Jesuit network adapted, waited, and returned, because their strength was never just in their presence. It was in their structure. a structure built around one man whose power does not come from the spotlight, but from the silence behind it. The Black Pope does not wear a crown. He does not need to. His authority is not based on ceremony. It is based on control. And in the world of quiet power, there is no throne more commanding than the one no one ever sees. Inside the walls of the Vatican, there are two men who lead. One stands in the light, the other moves in the shadows. One is known by billions, the other is known by almost no one. And together, they represent something few people ever question. Two thrones. One for the faith, one for the machine that keeps it running. The Pope is the face of the Catholic Church. He blesses crowds, speaks to nations, visits the poor. He is seen as a spiritual father to the world. But behind that image is an entire structure, a system of rules, influence, and global reach. And deep inside that structure sits the man who many believe runs the engine of the Church, the Superior General of the Jesuits, the Black Pope. On the surface, they are not rivals. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. The Black Pope is just a leader of one religious order. But the truth is far more complicated. Because while the Pope stands before cameras and waves from balconies, the Superior General is commanding one of the most powerful networks the Church has ever built. The Jesuits have schools, missions, political connections, intelligence reports, and access to almost every corner of the world. And all of it flows upward to one man, not to the Pope, to the General. He is not an advisor. He is not a servant. He is a commander. And his authority is not granted by the people. It is held in silence. Over the years, the Jesuit order has operated with a level of independence that makes even other church officials uneasy. They answer to their general first. They take orders from him directly. And in many ways, they have built a world inside the world, a quiet empire of minds and influence. This creates a strange kind of balance inside the Vatican. The Pope appears to lead the Church, but the General leads the Jesuits, who shape what the Church actually does on the ground. The Pope may speak of peace, but Jesuits negotiate in war zones. The Pope may speak of unity, but Jesuits manage rival interests behind closed doors. It is not about good or evil, it is about roles. The Pope gives the message, the General manages the mission, one is the face, the other is the hands. And while most people focus on the light, real control often lives in the places no one looks. There have been popes who tried to limit the Jesuits. There have been Jesuit generals who pushed the limits of their reach. But through it all, the two thrones remained. One public, one private, one symbolic, one strategic. In a city filled with crosses and marble, these two thrones are not carved from gold. They are made of influence. One rules the faith of the people, the other rules the structure that surrounds that faith. And between the two, history has been shaped more by silence than by sermons. In most religious groups, obedience is a virtue, something you try your best to follow. But in the Jesuit order, obedience is not just a virtue, it is the rule, the law, the foundation of everything they do. From the moment a man begins his training as a Jesuit, he is taught one lesson above all others: obey, without question, without hesitation, no matter what. This is not obedience like a student has to a teacher. It is deeper, more complete. Jesuits are trained to think, to debate, to reason. But once an order is given, all that stops. The mind yields, the will bends, and the command is carried out with full trust. The General speaks, the Jesuits act. This idea was built into the order from the very beginning. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, was a former soldier. He knew the value of discipline. He knew that an army does not win because every soldier has a different opinion. It wins because everyone moves as one. And so he shaped the Jesuits not like monks, but like an elite spiritual army. Their mission was to defend the church. Their weapon was obedience. Jesuit training takes years. Some study for over a decade before they are fully accepted, and during that time, they are tested not just in knowledge, but in loyalty. Superiors may give strange orders just to see how a young Jesuit reacts. If he hesitates, if he questions, he may not be ready. Because a Jesuit must trust that the command, no matter how difficult or mysterious, serves a higher purpose. The superior general is at the top of this chain. He is not just a leader, he is the final voice. Jesuits around the world obey him as if he were the voice of the order itself. When he speaks, his words carry the weight of command. He can send a Jesuit to the farthest part of the globe. He can assign missions that remain secret for years, and they will be carried out without resistance. To outsiders, this sounds extreme, even dangerous, but for the Jesuits, it is a kind of freedom. They do not have to guess what to do. They do not have to worry about politics or power struggles. They serve, they obey, and in doing so, they believe they are serving God in the purest way possible. But this kind of obedience also creates something unusual. A system where one man can guide the actions of thousands, quietly, effectively, globally. And because the Jesuits are so trusted, so respected, few people question what they are actually doing behind the scenes. It is not control in the way most people imagine. It is deeper. It is built into the bones of the order. A silent chain of command that connects missions in distant lands to a desk in Rome. And in that silence, decisions are made, not debated, not delayed, just obeyed. This is what makes the Jesuits different. They are not just priests, they are not just teachers, they are men who gave up everything except the right to say no. Beneath the beauty of the church lies something older than marble and deeper than faith. Beneath the cross itself, some say, there are secrets. Not written in scripture or sung in hymns, but whispered in hallways, passed from one generation to the next. Secrets about control, influence, and the quiet hands that never let go of the wheel. The Jesuits have always claimed to serve, to educate, to defend the church, and for centuries they have done just that. But behind that public mission, there have always been rumours that their reach goes beyond religion, that their loyalty to the church is only one layer of a much bigger plan, one that stretches from royal courts to financial markets, and even into the glowing screens of modern media. Start with the kings. In the past, Jesuits were invited into palaces as advisors, confessors, private tutors. But some believe they did more than give moral guidance. They influenced decisions, nudged policies, shifted the direction of empires, not through force, through influence, the kind that happens behind closed doors with no record and no witness. Then came the banks, the world of money. Jesuits have long been tied to education and science, but they also understood economics, how money flows, how markets rise and fall. Some believe that Jesuit-trained minds entered the world of finance not just to observe, but to shape, that their schools created a class of global thinkers who quietly built connections between church wealth and international power. And now there is media, the modern pulpit. Jesuit universities have produced generations of journalists, filmmakers, and media leaders. People who control the flow of stories, the shaping of opinion. If you control what people see, hear, and think, you do not need armies, you just need narrative. And Jesuits have always been masters of shaping minds. None of this is written in official documents. You will not find it carved in stone, but the whispers remain that Jesuits have helped install leaders, that they have protected secrets that could shake the world, that they have removed obstacles quietly when necessary, not through violence, through precision, through influence. Critics have tried to expose them for centuries. Conspiracy theories explode across books and internet forums. Some are wild, some are possible. But most agree on one thing. The Jesuits are not just a religious order. They are something more. A system, a network, a shadow structure, with eyes everywhere and a voice that rarely needs to speak. The Church denies it. Jesuits laugh it off. But the question stays. How did a group of priests become a symbol of control that reaches into the deepest layers of power? Maybe the answer is simple. Maybe they really are just servants of God, brilliant, disciplined, loyal. Or maybe the truth is hidden beneath layers of robes and rituals, beneath the cross, beneath the silence, in the one place no one is allowed to look. And maybe that is where the real story begins. In 1773, the most powerful religious order in the world vanished overnight. The Jesuits were banned, erased by a decree from the Pope himself, their schools shut down, their missions abandoned, their leaders exiled. It was one of the strangest moments in church history, because the men who had once been called the defenders of faith were suddenly treated like a threat to it. But why? The answer depends on who you ask. By the late 1700s, the Jesuits had grown into something enormous. They ran hundreds of schools. They advised kings and queens. They shaped the minds of future rulers. They held influence in every major corner of Europe and far beyond. And some people thought they had too much of it. Royal families had started to grow suspicious. The Jesuits seemed to operate above local laws. They answered only to their general in Rome. And behind their quiet obedience, people sensed something deeper. A network, a force, an invisible hand guiding not just the church, but entire nations. Portugal was the first to expel them. Then France, then Spain. One by one, the crowns of Europe turned against them. They blamed the Jesuits for revolts, for economic trouble, for interfering in politics. It became a domino effect, and soon the pressure landed squarely on the Vatican. Pope Clement XIV gave in. Surrounded by angry monarchs and facing collapse of political alliances, he signed the Order of Suppression. In it, he claimed the Jesuits had become too controversial, too divisive. For the peace of the Church, he said they had to be dissolved. And just like that, they were gone. But not really. The Jesuits did not disappear. They scattered. They went underground. Some found refuge in Russia, where the ban was never enforced. Others continued to work quietly in science and education. They waited. Not in anger, in strategy, because they believed the mission was not over, and that one day the world would need them again. That day came in 1814. A different pope sat on the throne. The political world had changed. The French Revolution had torn Europe apart. Monarchs had fallen. The Church had been weakened. And the Vatican needed strong hands, disciplined minds, loyal servants. So Pope Pius VII reversed the ban. the Jesuits were restored, officially, publicly, as if they had never been removed. It was not a small decision. It meant that the most controversial order in church history was now once again at the heart of it. And just like before, they returned with quiet precision, rebuilding schools, restarting missions, reconnecting with the shadows they once ruled. Some say that suppression was a warning, that even the church feared what it had created. Others say it was a test, a purge that proved only the most loyal survived. But the fact remains, the Jesuits were buried, then brought back, not weakened, refined. And in that return they reminded the world of one thing: you can silence a voice, but you cannot silence a system built to wait, built to adapt, built to resurrect. When most people think of the Jesuits, they picture priests in black robes holding books, not bankers holding gold. But behind the scenes, the Society of Jesus built something most religious orders never dared to touch: a network of financial power, quiet, complex, and far-reaching. Not just to fund their missions, but to shape the flow of wealth itself. It started with their schools. Jesuit academies attracted the sons of nobles, merchants, and political families. These students often became leaders in their own right, but they never forgot who taught them. That loyalty sometimes came with gifts: land, donations, endowments. Over time, the Jesuits became one of the wealthiest religious orders in the world. But it was not just wealth, it was how they used it. They were trained in logic, math, strategy. They understood economics in a way most clergy never did. While other orders focused on simple charity, the Jesuits began to manage money like a business, quietly, carefully, globally. They owned land across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, plantations in South America, vineyards in France, mining interests, shipping routes, all under the name of mission work. But these holdings produced massive income, and that income flowed into hidden vaults, not to enrich individuals, but to strengthen the order. They also acted as trusted advisors in financial matters. Royals and noble families turned to Jesuit priests for counsel, not just on the soul, but on their estates, their taxes, their trade. In some cases, Jesuits helped manage entire economies. They became known for their honesty and precision, which only gave them more access. Some believe they began to form their own informal banks, not buildings with signs or open hours, but a network of safe deposits, loans, and hidden transfers. Because they were everywhere, they could move money across borders, through letters, through contacts, through silence. Their connections reached deep into Catholic banking families, the Fuggers in Germany, the Borghese in Italy. Jesuits often served as intermediaries, making deals, smoothing tensions, ensuring funds reached the right hands at the right time, and always without drawing attention. But what made their influence different was their purpose. They did not chase profit for pleasure. They used money to build schools, fund missions, expand their reach, control knowledge. Money was never the goal. It was the tool. This made them harder to stop. They did not flaunt their wealth. They hid it behind holy work. And when critics questioned them, they simply pointed to the good they were doing, feeding the poor, educating the young, preaching the faith. The numbers stayed locked away. Over the centuries, rumours grew that they helped fund revolutions, that they held debt over kings, that they had secret vaults beneath Rome filled with gold and ancient documents. None of it proven, all of it whispered. What is clear is that the Jesuits knew how to handle power, and in the modern world, power often flows not from swords or sermons, but from silent accounts and careful transactions. The Jesuits understood that early, and they built a financial presence that lasted long after the ink on any banknote had faded. Before satellites and GPS, there were men with telescopes, compasses, and quills. Men who mapped the world by looking at the stars and listening to the land. And for centuries, some of the best mapmakers in the world were not kings or scientists or explorers. They were Jesuit priests. From the very beginning, the Jesuits believed that understanding the earth was part of understanding God. If the universe was created with order, then studying that order was a holy task. So they trained their members in geography, astronomy, and navigation, not just to explore, but to master the hidden structure of the world. When Jesuits travelled, they did more than preach. They measured coastlines, drew mountain ranges, calculated distances. They wrote down everything: the rivers, the stars, the way the moon shifted over foreign skies. And then they sent all that information back to Rome. Over time, these observations became maps. Not just drawings, but detailed tools used by merchants, missionaries, and even armies. Jesuit maps were trusted because they were based on science, not rumour. And because Jesuits were everywhere from China to Brazil, they had access to lands no one else could reach. In China, Jesuit astronomers worked in the imperial court. They helped predict eclipses and set calendars. The emperor trusted them more than his own scholars. In South America, they charted the Amazon long before any European explorer dared to enter the jungle. In Africa and India, they noted trade routes, weather patterns, and even local plants and minerals. But it was not just about making maps, it was about controlling knowledge. The Jesuits were among the first to understand that whoever controls geography controls movement, whoever understands the stars controls time, and whoever knows where everything is can decide where everyone else goes. They used this knowledge to help missionaries navigate across oceans, but they also used it to advise governments, guide ships, influence borders, all while appearing as humble priests in black robes. Their schools taught astronomy as part of the standard curriculum. They built observatories. They trained students to chart the heavens, and their writings were studied by scientists across Europe. Even during times when the Church resisted new science, the Jesuits quietly kept studying, recording, mapping. Their maps were not always perfect, but they were more accurate than most, and they were often the only ones available for certain regions. This gave them a quiet kind of power, because when people rely on your maps, they are trusting your version of the world. Some believe the Jesuits kept certain discoveries hidden, that they found lost ruins, ancient knowledge, or sacred lands, and chose not to share it. Others think they simply understood that too much truth too fast could shift the balance of power. Whatever the case, the Jesuit mapmakers were more than just travellers. They were builders of reality, drawing the outlines of continents, naming mountains, guiding ships across oceans, and in doing so shaping how the world saw itself. They did not need armies to conquer. They had compasses, telescopes, and a deep understanding of how powerful a map can be when no one else knows the way. Jesuit schools were known for being the best. If you were lucky enough to attend one, you were guaranteed a sharp mind, a deep education, and a place among the elite. But beneath all the praise and polished classrooms, there was something no one talked about, something buried under the lessons, a hidden curriculum. From the outside, Jesuit schools taught everything: language, science, philosophy, history. Students learned how to debate, how to think clearly, how to argue both sides of an issue. It felt open and rigorous. But the truth is, there were always limits. Invisible walls built around the minds of the students. And beyond those walls were the books they were never allowed to read. It started with the Index, a list of forbidden texts created by the Church. Anything that challenged official doctrine or questioned the nature of the universe too boldly could end up on it. And Jesuits were among the most loyal guardians of this list. In their schools, certain authors were erased completely. Others were only mentioned so their errors could be mocked. If a book taught a different view of creation, it was out. If a theory hinted that time was older than the Bible, claimed it was banned. If an idea dared to suggest that truth might exist outside the Church, it was silenced. Students did not know what they were missing, because the missing parts were never mentioned. Jesuit teachers were masters of presentation. They knew how to fill a student's mind with facts and structure, while quietly steering them away from forbidden paths. They would offer just enough information to make a student feel wise, but not enough to make them truly question. That was the genius of the hidden curriculum. It was not what was taught, it was what was kept out. Some students noticed. They asked about missing texts or strange gaps in lessons. Jesuits would gently guide them back to approved material, not with fear, with calm logic. The dangerous ideas were framed as confused or outdated, not worth their time. And most students moved on, never realizing they had been steered. Even science was shaped this way. Astronomy was allowed, but only within the framework the Church accepted. History was taught, but always pointed back to the authority of Rome. Logic was encouraged, as long as it never challenged the foundations beneath it. But the biggest secret of all was that some Jesuits themselves read the banned books. They had to defend against them, to understand the enemy. In private rooms behind locked doors, they studied the very texts their students were forbidden to touch. They knew exactly what they were hiding, and why. The hidden curriculum was not about lying. It was about control, shaping minds to believe they were free, while quietly closing every door that led beyond the Church. The Jesuits were not just teaching, they were programming. And the students who walked out of those schools carried knowledge in their hands and silence in their minds. Because sometimes the most powerful form of censorship is not burning books, it is making sure no one ever knows they existed. Words can build empires. They can start wars or end them. They can light fires in the minds of crowds or wrap them in silence. The Jesuits understood this better than anyone. From their very beginning, they trained not only in prayer or doctrine, but in the power of language. How to speak, how to write, how to persuade, but also when to say nothing at all. Jesuit students spent years learning the art of rhetoric, not just how to argue, but how to win without ever raising their voice. They studied ancient speeches, practiced debates, memorized lines that could turn any conversation in their favor. Their goal was never to shout the loudest. It was to speak with precision, calm, control every word chosen like a tool, every sentence built like a weapon. But it was not just about sounding smart. It was about understanding people, what they fear, what they trust, what they want to hear. Jesuits were trained to read a room before they ever opened their mouths, to spot the doubt, the pride, the need, and then tailor their words like a key sliding into a lock, not to force, to open. That is why they made such powerful advisors, confessors, diplomats. They knew how to speak with kings without challenging them, how to guide without appearing to lead. Jesuits could calm angry mobs or charm suspicious rulers. And in courtroom or palace, their voices always carried more than sound. They carried influence. But just as important as knowing when to speak was knowing when not to. Jesuits mastered the strategic use of silence. When a question was dangerous, they did not lie. They paused, shifted, deflected. Not with fear, with elegance. A well-timed silence can make a person doubt themselves. A missing answer can feel more mysterious than any explanation. This made the Jesuits hard to pin down, hard to accuse. When critics came at them with sharp words, the Jesuits often responded with calm ones, or none at all. Silence became their shield, their way of waiting out storms, letting their enemies shout until they ran out of breath. Even in their writings, Jesuits used language like a maze, layered meanings, gentle turns. A sentence that seemed simple might contain an argument hidden inside. Their books were studied for style as much as substance, because behind their words was always something more, a shape, a plan. The world listened, and sometimes feared them for it. Some called them silver-tongued. Others said they were too clever, too smooth, too hard to read, but that was the point. Jesuits did not seek praise. They sought results. And in the end, they proved that the greatest power does not always come from armies or gold. It comes from knowing exactly what to say, and exactly when to say it, or when to say nothing at all. Because silence is not empty. In the hands of the Jesuits, it became a language of its own. One the world still struggles to understand. A king may sit on a golden throne surrounded by guards and walls, but there is always one place where he is alone. The confessional, a quiet room, a whisper. A moment where even the most powerful man on earth must kneel and speak the truth. And more often than not, the one listening was a Jesuit. It might seem strange. Why would a ruler trust a priest with his darkest secrets? His doubts, his guilt, his sins. But Jesuits were not ordinary priests. They were trained not just in theology, but in psychology, in persuasion, in silence. They knew how to listen without judgment and guide without pressure. And once they gained a king's trust, they never lost it. Jesuits became confessors to emperors and queens, to generals and princes in France, in Spain, in the courts of Austria and Poland. These leaders invited Jesuits into their most private moments, and in doing so, they handed over something far more valuable than gold: their minds. Because confession was more than forgiveness, it was access. A Jesuit confessor heard everything: political fears, secret alliances, family scandals, plans of war. And he was bound by holy vow never to repeat what he heard. But that did not mean he could not act on it. This gave the Jesuits a kind of invisible power. They knew what was coming before anyone else. They understood the hidden cracks inside royal families. They could gently steer a king away from disaster or toward a decision that served the greater goal, not through control, through trust. Some say this made them dangerous, that they collected secrets like coins, that behind every royal decision there was a Jesuit whisper. Others say they were simply the best at what they did, that rulers turned to them because no one else could offer such calm guidance in a world filled with lies. Either way, the result was the same. A Jesuit confessor became more than a priest. He became a silent partner in power, and unlike politicians, he had no ambition of his own, no hunger for titles or land, which made his advice even more valuable. But leverage comes quietly. A Jesuit who knows a ruler's fears knows how to speak to them. A Jesuit who understands a king's guilt knows how to ease it or deepen it. And if a decision must be made that seems too cruel or bold, the Jesuit can frame it as duty, as necessary, as holy. This is not just theory, it is history. There are letters, records, even warnings from rival politicians who feared that Jesuit confessors were shaping policy from the shadows. And in some cases, they were right. Because to confess is to hand over control, to let someone else see your soul, and once that door is open, it is hard to close again. The Jesuits never asked for that power. They were given it, one whisper at a time, one secret after another, and they used it not for themselves but for something larger, a mission, a structure, a system of faith and influence that reached far beyond the confessional. In the end, the kings ruled with crowns, but the Jesuits ruled with silence. And sometimes that was louder than anything else. When Europe looked west and east and saw new lands to conquer, the Jesuits saw something else, opportunity. Not just for religion, but for control, quiet influence. The chance to shape entire continents before anyone else could. And so they packed their books and robes and crossed oceans, to the Americas, to Asia, to places where no one had ever heard of Rome, but soon would. In South America, the Jesuits did something remarkable. They built missions so large and organized, they were almost their own countries. These settlements, known as reductions, were not just churches, they were cities, complete with schools, farms, workshops, and laws. The Jesuits taught the native people to read, write, farm, and pray. But they also created a structure where Rome's word became law and Jesuit judgment was final. They built dozens of these missions, especially in areas like Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. And for a time, they became the real power in the jungle. Local governors left them alone, the crown was far away. And within those walls, the Jesuits created a strange kind of utopia. Orderly, peaceful, but under absolute control. Some praised them, others feared them. The missions were seen as too independent, too strong, too rich. The idea that priests could rule without kings made European powers nervous. Eventually, the missions were attacked and dismantled, but the memory stayed. The Jesuits had shown what they could do when no one was watching. In North America, their strategy was different. There were no vast missions. Instead, Jesuits moved quietly through forests and rivers, working with native tribes, learning their languages, building trust. They were not always welcome. Some were killed, others vanished, but they kept coming, always moving farther into the unknown. In Canada, they worked with the Huron. In the Great Lakes, they built small missions. They mapped the land, wrote down tribal histories, and translated prayers into native tongues. And always they sent reports back to Europe. Not just about souls, but about resources, land, alliances, power. In Asia, the Jesuits took an even bolder approach. In India, they studied Sanskrit and debated Hindu scholars. In Japan, they adapted their message to local customs. But it was in China that they made their deepest mark. Jesuits like Matteo Ricci entered the imperial court not as missionaries, but as scholars. They brought clocks, star charts, and maps. The emperor admired their knowledge and let them stay. For a time, Jesuits advised, the Chinese elite helped plan calendars and even taught science. They walked palace halls wearing Chinese robes and speaking fluent Mandarin. But their loyalty was still to Rome. This global reach made the Jesuits more than a religious order. They were a network, a shadow empire. Not always welcomed, not always understood, but always watching, always reporting, always influencing. They did not carry swords. They carried knowledge, culture, persuasion, and through that they held power in places where European armies had not yet arrived. From the rainforests of Brazil to the palaces of Beijing, the Jesuits left footprints everywhere, not by force but by strategy. And the world they touched was never the same. In the heart of the South American jungle, the Jesuits built something that almost no one expected. Not just missions or churches or schools, but kingdoms. Hidden realms ruled not by kings or armies, but by priests in black robes. These were called reductions, and for a time they were some of the most organized and mysterious societies in the New World. The word reduction sounds strange, but it meant something very specific. It was a place where native people were gathered or reduced into a new kind of village, a place where they could be taught Christian values, European customs, and the rules of civilization. At least, that is what the Jesuits told the world. But inside the reductions, something different was happening. These were not just villages. They were entire societies, built from scratch, designed with perfect order. Houses lined up in neat rows, churches at the centre, schools next to workshops, guards not with weapons, but with rules, Jesuit rules. The most famous of these were in what is now Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Deep in the rainforest, far from European cities, the Jesuits created settlements that functioned like tiny nations. They had their own laws, their own economy, their own defences, and most importantly, they had no outside rulers. The crown was thousands of miles away, and the colonial governors stayed out. In these reductions, the Jesuits taught the local Guarani people how to read, write, build, and farm. But they also trained them to follow orders, work together, and live under a system where the Jesuits were both spiritual leaders and political rulers. There were no taxes to the crown, no forced labour from outsiders. Everything was managed from within. Some called it a miracle, others called it a cult. But either way, it worked. These reductions thrived. They had hospitals, printing presses, orchestras, and schools. They produced food, music, and art. The Guarani people became skilled builders and musicians, and yet the outside world knew very little about what was really going on inside. That mystery made people nervous. Rumours spread that the Jesuits were building their own empire, that they were hiding gold, that they were creating an army loyal only to Rome. European powers, especially Spain and Portugal, started to worry. Because while other colonies struggled, these priest-run villages were growing stronger by the day. Eventually, pressure built. The Jesuits were accused of holding too much power. Armies were sent in, missions were destroyed, the reductions fell. Some were burned, others were abandoned, and the great experiment vanished into the forest. But the legend remained. A story of how a group of priests with no guns, no kings, and no orders from Europe had once ruled their own mysterious world deep in the jungle. A world where the church ran everything. A world that was both peaceful and strict, generous and controlling. The Jesuit reductions were not just missions. They were a glimpse of what the world might look like if priests ran nations. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. Because they actually made it work. Revolutions are loud. Fire in the streets. Crowds shouting for change. Leaders rising from nowhere. But behind all that noise, there are often whispers. Ideas planted years before. messages passed in silence. And sometimes in those whispers, you hear a familiar name, the Jesuits. Officially, the Jesuits were men of peace, educators, missionaries, loyal servants of the church. But rumors followed them like shadows, that they were not just watching history, they were shaping it. That behind certain revolutions, behind sudden political shifts, there were Jesuit minds pulling strings from behind the curtain. It is not hard to see why people believe it. The Jesuits were everywhere, in courts, in schools, in confessional booths. They trained the thinkers, the speakers, the ones who would one day lead. And their schools were not just about memorizing facts. They taught students how to think, how to argue, how to stand against authority if needed. Some of the loudest voices in revolutions were educated in Jesuit classrooms. They grew up reading scripture by day and philosophy by night, learning how to question the world without ever looking like rebels, until the day they finally did. In France, just before the revolution, many of the thinkers who challenged the monarchy were shaped by Jesuit logic. In Latin America, some of the leaders who fought against Spanish rule had Jesuit mentors. In the American colonies, some saw the influence of Jesuit strategy in the way rebellion was organized, quietly, patiently, from within. Of course, the Jesuits never admitted to any of it, and maybe they had nothing to do with it. Maybe they just taught people too well, gave them the tools to think, and then stepped back, as those minds made their own decisions. But some say that is exactly what made them dangerous. Because a revolution does not always start with a gun. Sometimes it starts with a question, a doubt, a whisper in a classroom or a confession. And the Jesuits knew how to plant those seeds, carefully, silently, in the name of justice, or in the name of control. There are also darker claims that Jesuits funded uprisings through hidden money, that they helped spread propaganda or guided rebel leaders, that when a revolution suited their goals, they helped it grow, and when it didn't, they helped it fail. We may never know the full truth. Jesuits kept their records sealed, their missions wrapped in layers of loyalty and silence. And history rarely shows who was standing behind the men on the front lines. But what we do know is this. Revolutions need minds before they need weapons. They need ideas before they need leaders. And for centuries, the Jesuits were experts at both. Whether they were behind the revolutions or simply beside them, one thing is clear. Where history shifted, the Jesuits were often nearby, watching, listening, teaching, and sometimes just waiting for the right spark to turn silence into fire. There was a time when the tension inside the Vatican was not between saints and sinners, but between priests and priests. Men who wore the same robes, followed the same prayers, served the same God. But beneath the surface, a cold war was growing, quiet, careful, and dangerously close to open conflict. Some called it a battle of ideals, others called it something darker, a Vatican civil war. On one side was the official church hierarchy, cardinals, bishops. The men who held the titles ran the councils and followed the visible rules of power. On the other side were the Jesuits, no thrones, no cathedrals of their own, but influence that stretched across continents, minds, kings, and maybe even the future. At first, the two sides worked together. Jesuits offered brains and obedience. The hierarchy offered protection and approval. But, as time passed, things started to shift. The Jesuits grew in size and reach. Their missions became nations. Their schools created future leaders. Their confessors whispered into the ears of monarchs. And the hierarchy began to feel something they had not expected. Fear. Because Jesuit influence was different. It was not always public. It did not always ask permission. It flowed underneath, around, through, and soon questions began to rise. Were the Jesuits really obeying the church, or just playing a longer game? Were they servants of the Pope, or something else entirely? Tensions boiled over in the 1700s. Jesuits were being expelled from countries across Europe. Governments said they were meddling in politics, getting too close to power. The Vatican tried to defend them. At first, but pressure kept rising. Accusations piled up that the Jesuits were manipulating kings, hiding wealth, running a shadow empire inside the church. Finally, in 1773, Pope Clement XIV gave in. He signed a decree that officially suppressed the Society of Jesus. In plain words, he shut them down, expelled their members, closed their schools, ended their missions. It was a stunning blow, like a general exiling his best soldiers. But even then, the war was not over. The Jesuits never truly disappeared. In some places, they went underground. In others, they were quietly protected. And 41 years later, another pope reversed the suppression, brought them back, officially, fully, as if nothing had ever happened. Some say the hierarchy never truly trusted them again. Others say the Civil War simply went quiet, turned into a game of politics behind velvet curtains. A silent chess match where every move was watched and every piece could become a threat. Today, the Jesuits are still part of the church. Respected, powerful, global. But the old tension remains. Because they are not like other orders. They are trained to think, to lead, to influence, and when influence becomes too obvious, it can feel like rebellion. The Vatican Civil War may never have had a battlefield, but its echoes still shape the halls of Rome in every council, in every silence, in the question no one dares ask too loudly. Who really holds the keys to the kingdom? And who just holds the spotlight? The Inquisition is one of the darkest chapters in church history, a time when questions became crimes and silence became survival. People think of torture chambers, hidden dungeons, and heretics burning in public squares. But behind the flames and the fear, there was something colder, smarter, a mind guiding the machine. And some believe that mind belonged to the Jesuits. Officially, the Jesuits were not executioners. They did not light the fires or swing the blades. Their hands were clean. But influence is not always about what you do. Sometimes it is about what you whisper, what you recommend, what you choose not to stop. The Jesuits had the perfect tools. They were masters of language, experts in theology. They knew how to question someone until the truth fell out or until the person broke. They could guide an interrogation without ever raising their voice, and their knowledge of forbidden ideas made them dangerous to anyone who tried to hide one. They were also loyal, completely, to the Pope, to the Church, to their mission, and that mission was to protect the faith at all costs. Even if that meant rooting out those who asked the wrong questions or read the wrong books. In the eyes of the Jesuits, heresy was not just a mistake, it was a sickness. And sometimes the cure required silence or fire. It is said that Jesuits helped identify targets, that they whispered names into the ears of inquisitors, that they trained others how to spot a heretic, not just by what they said, but by how they thought, that they helped write the rules of what could be read, what could be spoken, what could even be imagined. There are letters from that time filled with warnings about Jesuit influence in the courts of the Inquisition, that they were behind the scenes shaping trials, crafting arguments, tightening the noose with words, not ropes. They had access to secrets, confessions, and they knew how to use them. But their power went beyond individuals. The Jesuits helped create a system, a network of control. They helped build the index of forbidden books. They helped define orthodoxy. They created the intellectual walls that kept dangerous ideas locked out and dangerous people locked up. And they did it with a smile, with calm, with precision. No need for swords when a question could do the same damage. No need for prisons when fear could make people stay quiet forever. Of course, they were not the only ones behind the Inquisition. Many hands turned the gears, but the Jesuits gave it something unique. A mind, a strategy, a purpose that lasted long after the fires went cold. In the end, their role may never be fully proven. Records were burned, witnesses silenced, and history written by the victors. But the suspicion remains that behind the mask of the scholar, behind the robes of the priest, there stood something colder. Not a man with a torch, a man with a plan. And that may have been even more terrifying. There is a piece of paper that has haunted the Jesuits for centuries. An oath, long, violent, almost theatrical. It speaks of infiltration, of deception, of total obedience to the Pope, even if it means killing kings and tricking nations. It is called the Extreme Jesuit Oath, and for generations it has been the centre of one burning question: is it real? The oath first surfaced in the late 1800s. It described a ceremony straight out of a spy novel. A Jesuit kneeling before a superior general swearing to become all things to all people, to lie, cheat, or even kill in the name of the Church. It talked about blending into governments, pretending to be friends of heretics while secretly destroying them from within. It ended with a chilling promise that the Jesuit would obey without question, no matter what. For some it was proof of what they always feared, that the Jesuits were not just priests, they were infiltrators, operatives, warriors in robes, using religion as a mask for political control. Books, newspapers, and speeches quoted the oath as fact. It was reprinted again and again, fueling conspiracy theories and anti-Catholic fears across Europe and America. But there is one problem. The Vatican has always denied it. Jesuit leaders have called it a fake, a forgery, a piece of propaganda made by enemies who wanted to smear their name. And to be fair, no one has ever found an original version in Jesuit records. No document signed, no witness who swore it actually happened. The style of the writing is also strange, more like a bad script than a holy vow. Still, the controversy refuses to die. Why? Because even if the oath is fake, some say the ideas in it are not. Over the years, the Jesuits have been accused of infiltrating governments, guiding revolutions, silencing dissent. Whether or not they swore to do it in secret ceremonies, people believe they did it in practice. It is the perfect storm. An order famous for silence, intelligence, and global reach. A shadowy past filled with rumours of control, and a dramatic oath that fits the fear like a glove. Whether real or not, the oath feels possible, and sometimes that is more powerful than truth. The Jesuits themselves have tried to laugh it off. They point to their work in education, charity, science. They argue that they are thinkers, not spies, servants, not secret agents. But even they know the power of a story. Once an idea like that takes root, it is almost impossible to kill. So, did the Jesuits ever swear the extreme oath? Probably not, but that may not matter, Because the real question is not what they said in a dark room centuries ago, it is what they did after they walked out. And for many, that answer is still unclear. Sometimes a lie becomes legend, and sometimes legend becomes the truth people believe. The oath controversy sits somewhere in between, a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about power, obedience, and the thin line between faith and control. Ask almost anyone who the Pope is, and they will tell you right away. They will picture the man in white, standing on the balcony of St. Peter's. They will know his face, his name, his voice. But ask them who the Superior General of the Jesuits is, and most will stare blankly. And yet some believe that this man, known as the Black Pope, holds even more power than the one in white. Right now, the Black Pope is Arturo Sosa, a Venezuelan priest elected in 2016 to lead the Society of Jesus. He wears no crown. He makes no speeches to the world. He does not bless crowds from balconies. But behind the scenes, he commands the largest and most influential Catholic order on earth. And unlike the Pope, he is not expected to retire. The title Black Pope comes not from anything evil, but from his black robes. Still the name carries weight. It whispers of secrets and silent authority, of a man who does not seek fame because he already has influence, a man who answers only to the Pope, but is known to shape policy, culture, and missions on a global scale. The Jesuit order is built on obedience, absolute and final. When the Superior General speaks, Jesuits listen. They do not vote. They do not debate. They follow. And because Jesuits are everywhere in universities, in missions, in politics, in Vatican, offices that voice carries far, Arturo Sosa is not a flashy man. He has spoken on education, on poverty, on justice. He avoids scandal. He avoids headlines. But every move he makes sends signals to Jesuit institutions across the globe. He shapes how they teach, how they serve, how they think. And yet, most Catholics do not know his name. That is how the Jesuits prefer it. Their power is not in the spotlight. It is in the infrastructure. The gears turning beneath the surface. Quiet influence is still influence, and in some ways it is even stronger because it is hard to trace. Some wonder why there is so little media attention on the Black Pope, why his role is not more discussed. Maybe it is because he avoids the stage. Or maybe it is because talking about him too much raises questions no one wants to answer. How much does he really control? How often does he advise the Pope? Are there decisions we think came from the top, but were actually born in the Jesuit headquarters? These are not conspiracy theories. These are real questions that come from the unusual shape of Jesuit power. In a world obsessed with visibility, the Black Pope remains invisible. But that does not mean he is weak. It may mean he is stronger than we think, because true power often hides itself. It works through systems people trust. It moves through networks, not headlines. And so Arturo Sosa continues his work, quietly, faithfully, globally. Unknown to most, but never uninvolved. He is the man behind the order, the voice behind the silence, and the question behind every curtain of church power. Who really holds the keys to Rome? The one we see, or the one we never do? There is a phrase that shows up again and again in late-night documentaries, internet forums, and whispered conversations. The New World Order, a hidden plan by elites to reshape the world. To erase borders, control governments, and centralize power into a single global system. And somehow, the Jesuits are almost always part of the story. It sounds like something out of a spy thriller. black-robed priests secretly guiding presidents, rewriting school books, planning wars, and revolutions, all to bring about a new kind of empire. Not with swords or armies, but with education, influence, and silence. But where does this idea come from, and how much of it is real? The Jesuits have always made people nervous. Not because they stand at the altar, but because they stand in places most priests do not. Universities, government offices, think tanks, media networks, they are thinkers, planners, strategists. That makes them powerful. And to some people, power in silence always feels suspicious. Conspiracy theorists point to the Jesuits' global presence, how they train leaders all over the world, how their schools shape how people think, how their members show up in surprising places. They say the Jesuits are not just teaching values, they are guiding the future. Not just for the church, but for the entire planet. There are claims that the Jesuits are part of a globalist elite working with bankers, world leaders, and secret societies. That they influence organizations like the United Nations and the European Union. That their real mission is not to serve God, but to bring about a single world government where religion is controlled and dissent is silenced. They point to quotes from old speeches, to shadowy connections between Jesuit alumni and powerful decision makers. They bring up the Jesuit ties to science, to economics, to global diplomacy. They say the Society of Jesus has become something more than a religious order. It has become a system of control. But here is the hard truth. Most of these claims are based on fear, not facts. The Jesuits are influential, but so are many organizations. They educate, but they do not rule. They speak, but they do not command nations. Their vow of obedience is to the Pope, not to a secret council of global elites. Still, the theory survives because it explains something people feel. That the world is moving too fast. That decisions are being made far above them. That someone must be behind it all. And the Jesuits, with their long history of silence and strategy, become the perfect target. Are there Jesuits in powerful places? Yes. Have they shaped world events? In some cases, absolutely. But are they sitting in a dark room, pulling every string? Probably not. The line between truth and fear is thin. And the Jesuits have always walked that line. Their power is real, but so is the myth. And sometimes the myth grows faster than the truth can catch it. In the end, the New World Order might be fiction, but the question it asks is still haunting. Who is really guiding the world? And are they doing it in the name of peace, faith, or something else entirely? Popes are supposed to be the highest authority in the Catholic Church, the Vicar of Christ, the voice of God on earth. But what if the man on the throne was not the one holding the reins? What if behind the white robes and the famous smile there were black-robed hands guiding every step? This is the question that has followed the Jesuits into the modern age. Not whether they serve the Pope, but whether they shape him. Not whether they obey, but whether they influence. And when it comes to recent popes, the line between servant and master gets a little blurry. For centuries, popes and Jesuits had a complicated relationship. Sometimes warm, sometimes tense, but always careful. The Jesuits were too powerful, too smart, and too global to be ignored. They were the Church's secret weapon and its quiet threat. Some popes embraced them, others tried to shut them down. But everything changed in 2013. That was the year Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis. And for the first time in history, the man in white was also a Jesuit. This broke an old tradition. Jesuits were never supposed to seek power. They were trained to serve from the shadows, not lead from the front. but Francis had been a Jesuit for decades, raised in their mindset, shaped by their discipline. And suddenly, the question became unavoidable. Was this Pope his own man or the ultimate insider? Some saw his election as a victory for the Jesuit order, a sign that their strategy, patience, and loyalty had paid off. Others saw it as a danger, that the Church had placed absolute power into the hands of a system that preferred silence to sunlight. Since taking office, Francis has pushed for reforms. He talks about poverty, justice, inclusion. He speaks more like a professor than a king. And many of his actions reflect classic Jesuit thinking: focused, strategic, global. Some say that behind every speech, behind every policy, there are Jesuit advisors shaping the message, guiding the tone. Even before Francis, other popes were surrounded by Jesuit counselors, theologians, confessors, speechwriters, men trained to think like generals and speak like saints. They were not in charge, but they were always close, and closeness is a kind of power. The question is not whether popes listen to Jesuits. They do. The question is whether that listening ever becomes dependence, whether guidance becomes direction, whether the man on the balcony is really the one making the call. There is no proof of manipulation, no confession, no leaked document that shows Jesuit orders behind papal decisions. But the pattern is there, and the silence around it only fuels the whispers. Maybe popes are not puppets, but maybe they are not entirely free either. Maybe in a church built on tradition and secrecy, the real power flows not from the spotlight, but from the shadows. And if that is true, then every word the Pope speaks might carry an echo. A whisper from the order that raised him, trained him, and now quietly stands behind the throne. It happened in 2013. A white puff of smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, and the world turned its eyes to the balcony of St. Peter's. The announcement was made in Latin, and most people didn't understand it at first. But then the name became clear. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a cardinal from Argentina, a man almost no one saw coming. And then something even more unexpected was revealed. He was a Jesuit. For the first time in history, the Catholic Church had elected a Jesuit pope, and that changed everything. The Jesuits were never supposed to lead the Church. Their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, had made that clear. Jesuits were meant to serve, not rule, to teach, not reign, to work in silence, not stand in the spotlight. Becoming Pope went against centuries of their own tradition. But here was Pope Francis, a man shaped by the Jesuit way of thinking, strategic, disciplined, global, humble but sharp, quiet but powerful. And suddenly the question wasn't just who he was, it was what he represented. Francis came from a world of Jesuit missions, from dusty classrooms and quiet chapels. He spoke about the poor, about mercy, about shaking up the old systems. He chose not to live in the grand papal palace, but in a simple guest house. He wore plain white robes and carried his own bag. People called him the people's pope, but behind his simplicity was something more complex. A lifetime of Jesuit training. That training teaches obedience, but also independence. Jesuits are taught to think critically, to understand power, to engage the world with both faith and reason. So when a Jesuit becomes pope, you are not just getting a priest, you are getting a man trained to lead with precision. Some cheered the election. They said the church needed a new voice, someone unafraid to challenge corruption and speak plainly. Others were uneasy. A Jesuit pope meant the Jesuit worldview now sat at the highest seat of power. The line between influence and authority had disappeared. And then there were the whispers that Pope Francis was not just one man, but a symbol, a sign that the Jesuit order had finally completed a mission centuries in the making, to rise quietly, to gain trust, and to place one of their own on the throne. Francis has denied being controlled by anyone. He acts like a man who knows who he is. But even he has said that he thinks like a Jesuit, makes decisions like a Jesuit, and sees the world through Jesuit eyes. That matters. Because the Society of Jesus is not just a religious order. It is a global network with its own way of shaping minds. And now that mind wears the white robes of Peter. A Jesuit pope is not just a break from tradition. It is a moment that reveals how deep Jesuit influence runs. And it raises a question that still makes people nervous. Did the Church choose a pope? Or did the Jesuits finally choose one of their own to lead them all? Beneath the streets of Vatican City there is a door with no name. Behind that door are miles of shelves, ancient scrolls, sealed boxes, forgotten languages. It is called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, but most people still call it by its older, more mysterious name, the Vatican Secret Archive. For centuries, this archive has held the Church's deepest records. Officially, it is a library of letters, maps, decrees, and history, but to outsiders, it feels more like a vault. And one question has always hovered around it like a ghost. Who really controls it? Some say the Jesuits do. On paper, the Vatican says the archive is managed by its own department. Scholars can request permission to see certain documents, but not all, not most, and definitely not the ones people are most curious about. Whole sections are off limits, entire collections sealed. Even popes have admitted that there are parts of the archive they have never entered. And here is where the Jesuits come in. Because for over 400 years, they have trained the best minds in the Church. They are historians, translators, code breakers. They understand ancient languages and political secrets. If someone needed to catalogue forbidden knowledge, the Jesuits would be the ones to do it. There are reports that Jesuits have had special access to parts of the archive no one else has touched, that they helped organise the most sensitive materials, that they act not as gatekeepers, but as quiet curators. No titles, no spotlights, just keys. What lies behind those locked shelves is anyone's guess. Letters from kings begging for favours, maps that rewrite history, banned books, reports on miracles or heresies or disappearances. Maybe even things older than Christianity, things that challenge the very story of the Church. Some believe the archive contains evidence that certain events never happened, or that timelines were altered, or that secrets about angels, demons, or ancient technology have been kept hidden for centuries. Theories spin wild, but one fact remains. The archive is real, and most of it is closed. Why would Jesuits want control over it? Because knowledge is power, and hidden knowledge is the most powerful kind. If the Jesuits believe their mission is to protect the Church and guide the world, then keeping dangerous truths locked away might feel like duty, not deception. But that kind of control comes with a cost. It creates questions, suspicions, shadows that grow darker with every locked door. Are the Jesuits hiding something too big to reveal? Or are they protecting a world that is not ready to understand its own past? The truth may be buried in a shelf 5 stories below Rome, wrapped in dust, bound in leather, and marked with a symbol only a Jesuit would recognize. The Vatican Secret Archive is not just a library, it is a vault of memory, And if the Jesuits hold the keys, then maybe they also hold the story the world was never meant to read. Rome has always been a city of power. Once it was ruled by emperors. Now it is ruled by robes. One white, one black. One that speaks to the world, one that stays silent. One that offers blessings from balconies. One that moves through shadows behind stone walls. Most people only know one of them, but the real mystery begins when you look at both. The Pope is the public face, the shepherd, the vicar of Christ. When people think of the Catholic Church, they see him. He travels the world, kisses babies, wears the crown of tradition. He represents faith, hope, authority. But there is another figure who never stands on that balcony. The Superior General of the Jesuits, known by many as the Black Pope. He is not called that because of evil. It is because of his black robes and quiet role. But the name fits in more ways than one, because while the Pope offers the voice, the Black Pope controls the mind. While the Pope is watched by the world, the Black Pope moves beneath it. Together they form what some call the twin powers of Rome. Two thrones, two centres of control. One leads the visible church, the other leads its most powerful and secretive order. And some wonder if their roles are more connected than we are allowed to believe. Is it possible they are playing two sides of the same game? The Pope speaks of mercy, the Jesuits speak of mission. The Pope walks with crowds, the Jesuits walk with kings. One offers comfort, the other offers calculation. But both shape the direction of the Church, and both understand the world in ways most people never will. Throughout history, popes have relied on Jesuits for advice, for education, for political strategy. And when a Jesuit became pope for the first time, the lines blurred even more. Suddenly the twin powers sat within one man, a pope who thought like a Jesuit, who made decisions like a general, who trusted silence more than spectacle. Some believe this is not an accident, that the Church has always balanced light with shadow, words with action, that the Pope and the Black Pope are not rivals, but partners, one to guide the flock, one to guard the mission. Together they keep control, one above, one below. But others are not so sure. They see competition, quiet tension, a secret battle for influence that stretches across continents, that maybe the twin powers do not always agree, that sometimes the Black Pope moves faster than the one in white, and the world only sees the results, never the struggle behind them. No one outside the inner circle really knows how deep the connection goes. What is discussed behind closed doors? Who defers to whom? Who really holds the reins when decisions must be made that shape the fate of nations or the direction of faith itself? But one thing is clear. The Church is not led by one man. It never was. Behind every blessing is a strategy. Behind every symbol is a structure. And behind the white throne of Peter, there has always been a shadow, a second seat of power, hidden, quiet, watching, always. Not all power looks like a throne or a sword. Some of it hides in ideas, in the way people are taught to think about God, about right and wrong, about what truth really means. And when it comes to shaping minds, few groups have been more skilled, more careful, and more quiet than the Jesuits. From the very beginning, the Jesuits were trained to be different, not just to preach, but to think, to argue, to adapt. Their doctrine was not frozen in stone, it was flexible. It could twist and bend to match the moment. And at the centre of this flexibility was a bold idea, that power itself could be holy if used the right way. In Jesuits, thinking truth is not always black and white. Sometimes it depends on context, on intention, on what serves the greater good. This idea comes from a method they use called casuistry. It means looking at moral decisions case by case, not judging with one rule, but with careful logic, and that might sound wise, until it starts to bend too far. Because when truth becomes flexible, it can also become dangerous. It can be used to justify almost anything. A lie might be okay if it protects someone's soul. A hidden plan might be holy if it stops a greater evil. Even obedience to higher power can be twisted into a tool for control, not because they want to dominate, but because they believe they must guide. Jesuits believe in salvation, but their version is not just about belief. It is about discipline, obedience, total surrender of the will. The famous Jesuit training teaches members to see themselves like a dead body in the hands of the order, to move not by their own will, but by the voice of their superiors. And when that kind of control is seen as spiritual, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. They teach others the same way. In schools across the world, they shape how students see history, science, philosophy. They train future leaders, not just to learn, but to think the Jesuit way, strategic, sharp, loyal, always aiming toward a goal that is often hidden behind big words and calm voices. This is not evil, but it is powerful. And when you believe that your mission is blessed by God, that your methods are tools of salvation, then limits start to blur. Control starts to feel like duty, and bending truth can feel like protecting it. That is the heart of the Jesuit doctrine of power. Not raw force, not public domination, but the slow, steady shaping of thought, the kind of influence that no one sees until it is already there. Some call it wisdom, others call it manipulation. But either way it works, because ideas last longer than empires, and the Jesuits have always known that. They do not need to rule, they just need to shape the rules, not to own the throne, just to whisper to the one who does. And that whisper often sounds a lot like truth, even when it isn't. Time feels like something solid, a ticking clock, a turning planet, a calendar pinned to the wall. But what if time was not just measured? What if it was designed, organized, edited? What if the flow of history we all follow was not only recorded by the Church, but reshaped by the Jesuits themselves? It sounds impossible, but look closely and the pieces start to appear. In the late 1500s, something strange happened. The calendar we used to follow, called the Julian calendar, started to fall out of sync with the seasons. The spring equinox was drifting. Easter kept moving. The stars were no longer lining up with the dates. It was a problem not just for astronomers, but for the Church itself. So the Vatican turned to someone they trusted: Jesuits, scientists, mathematicians, thinkers. They were not just priests. They were trained in precision, in control. And they were given a mission. Fixed time. The result was the Gregorian calendar, the one most of the world uses today. Named after Pope Gregory XIII, but shaped by Jesuit minds, they cut 10 days from the year. Just removed them. October 4th, 1582 was followed by October 15th. Time jumped forward, and with it, something else changed: control. Because calendars are not just about dates. They decide when people celebrate, when they fast, when they plant, when they pray. They shape culture, rhythm, memory. Whoever controls the calendar controls how history is remembered. The Jesuits understood this. Their changes weren't just mathematical, they were spiritual, political, strategic. They gave the Church back control over Easter, over the liturgical cycle. over how time was tracked in Catholic countries. And this was just the beginning. Jesuits also helped rewrite history books. They organized timelines taught in schools across Europe. They decided what events mattered and what could be forgotten. They placed Christ at the center of everything. Year zero. Everything before became before Christ. Everything after became after. They helped define historical eras. The Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, labels that shaped how people saw the past, and by extension, how they saw themselves. They created a story where the church was the heart of civilization, and the Jesuits were its timekeepers. Even holidays carry their fingerprints. Many Christian celebrations sit on top of older pagan festivals. The timing of Christmas, the placement of Easter, blends of faith and strategy. Jesuits did not invent this pattern, but they helped reinforce it, teach it, spread it. And so time became a tool, not just for organizing days, but for organizing thought, a kind of clockwork theology, where every tick was sacred, every season planned, every year numbered in a way that reinforced the Church's version of history. People rarely question calendars. They accept them, trust them, but the truth is time, as we know, it was crafted, adjusted, and guarded by men who believed their mission came from God. Jesuits did not just measure time, they shaped it. And in doing so, they may have shaped everything we believe about the past, and maybe even the future. You do not see their name on billboards. You do not hear their slogans on the radio. They do not show up in flashy ads or make loud promises. But they are still everywhere. In lecture halls, in embassies, in policy meetings, even in places where no cameras are allowed. The Jesuits are still at work. Quietly, carefully, constantly, and most people have no idea. Their modern presence starts with education. Jesuits run some of the top universities in the world: Georgetown, Boston College, Fordham, Santa Clara. Schools that produce presidents, senators, CEOs, diplomats. But these are not just regular campuses, they are training grounds. Places where young minds are shaped not just by facts but by a certain way of thinking. Critical, strategic, global, the Jesuit way. Their schools teach philosophy and ethics, but also economics, politics, and international law. And behind every classroom is a deeper goal: to raise people who can influence the future, not by shouting, but by guiding, by advising, by being in the right room at the right time. Jesuit influence also stretches into diplomacy. Many of their top scholars have become advisors to presidents or consultants for global organizations. They speak multiple languages. They understand history. They know how to negotiate. They rarely take credit, but their fingerprints are often found on peace deals, policy papers, and long-term plans. Some even believe Jesuits have ties to intelligence agencies. It sounds like fiction, but think about it. They travel the world. They speak local dialects. They know how to blend in. They study human behavior. If any religious group had the tools to operate in high-level intelligence work, it would be them. And while nothing is officially confirmed, there are whispers. Jesuit alumni in unexpected places. Silent advisors with powerful friends. What makes all of this more mysterious is how little it is discussed. The Church talks about theology. Politicians talk about freedom. Universities talk about research. But the Jesuit role in connecting all of it stays quiet, almost invisible, like a string no one wants to pull too hard. That is not an accident. Jesuits were trained in the art of silent influence. From their earliest days they knew that being seen too much made people nervous, that true power does not need applause. It needs access, and access is easier when you are trusted, when people forget you are even there. They do not need to control everything. Just guide it, nudge it, whisper into the right ear, shape the path instead of marching in front. It is slower than force, but it lasts longer. It builds roots. It becomes part of the system. In the modern world, power is no longer just about titles or armies. It is about who shapes the conversation, who trains the leaders, who writes the first draft of truth. And in all of that, the Jesuits are still here. Not loud, not obvious, but always present and always watching. Every story has a face, a symbol people can see, a voice they can hear. In the Catholic Church, that face is the Pope, the man in white, smiling on balconies, riding through cheering crowds, blessing the faithful, leading prayers. He is the figure billions recognize. But is he the one holding the keys? That is the question that has haunted the Church for centuries. Because behind the Pope, there is another figure. One without cameras or crowds. One who does not wave or preach. One who stays in the shadows, but never far from the center of power. The superior general of the Jesuits, the man they call the Black Pope. The name sounds dramatic, but it points to something very real. A structure of influence that most people never see. The Black Pope does not wear white robes. He does not speak from the balcony. But his order has shaped minds, policies, and even popes for more than 400 years. If the Pope is the face of the Church, then maybe the Black Pope is the hand, quiet, steady, always moving just behind the scenes. His reach extends through universities, diplomacy, intelligence, schools, missions, media. His priests are trained like soldiers. His organization runs like a military, and his authority over Jesuits is absolute. So the question is not who wears the crown. It is who draws the map, who whispers the strategy, who has access to the archives, the scholars, the networks that shape the direction of faith across the globe. Many popes have relied on Jesuit advisors. Some have feared their growing influence. And now, with a Jesuit pope sitting in Rome, the line between the white throne and the black robe has never been more blurred. One leads, the other guides. But sometimes, guiding is more powerful than leading. The Black Pope does not need to give orders to control outcomes. All he needs is to shape how people think, to build the schools, to train the leaders, to choose which books are taught and which are locked away. Control the mind, and the rest follows. There is no official admission that the Jesuits run the Vatican. But look at history. Look at the networks. Look at the strange silence that surrounds the name of the superior general. Even when his role is massive, his name is rarely spoken. That silence says something. Maybe the Pope holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But maybe the Black Pope holds the keys to everything else. The vaults, the plans, the future. It does not mean the Pope is a puppet. It does not mean the Church is evil. But it does mean the structure is deeper than it looks. And the true power might not always be where the spotlight is. So, who really holds the keys? Maybe the answer is not either or. Maybe it is both. The Pope for the people, the Black Pope for the machine. Two parts of the same system. One seen, one hidden. But always working together. And always in control. Every cathedral is built with two things. Stone and silence. One you can touch, the other you can feel. The Catholic Church is the same. It has its visible form, its statues, its rituals, its holy words spoken in open air. But behind all of that lives something quieter, something older, a presence in the dark, a structure hidden behind the songs and the stained glass. Some say this is what gives the Church its strength, that it stands because it is built on both tradition and mystery, both the light and the shadow. But what happens when those two parts start pulling in different directions? The Pope stands in the light, his face is on coins, his words are in headlines, he calls for peace, for mercy, for faith. He walks among the people, he kisses the feet of the poor. He leads with compassion, but even the most faithful know that he does not walk alone. There is another force in Rome, one that does not kneel before cameras or speak in public squares. The Jesuit order, the superior general, the man they call the Black Pope. He moves with quiet precision. His work is not to inspire the masses, it is to guide the machine, to keep the gears turning behind the scenes. This is where the Church divides, not officially, not on paper, but in presence, in function, in philosophy. Can one institution truly serve two masters? One who leads with light, and one who commands from the shadow? One who speaks openly, and one who speaks only when necessary? For centuries it has tried, and maybe that is the real miracle, that something so vast, so layered, so ancient has survived by balancing opposites. But the cracks show, if you look closely, in the quiet power struggles, in the banned books, in the whispers from within its own walls. Not all cardinals agree, not all popes trust, not all Jesuits follow. The Church teaches unity, one God, one truth, one path to salvation. But behind the altar, the structure looks more like a chessboard, and not all the pieces are playing the same game. The light offers comfort, the shadow offers control. The light shows the world what it wants to see. The shadow ensures that nothing is lost when the lights go out. And in the middle are the people, billions of believers, who will never walk through the Vatican halls, who will never know what lies beneath, who trust that the face they see is the one truly in charge. But maybe the real question is not whether the Church is divided. Maybe it has always been built this way. Light and shadow, seen and unseen, holy and strategic. Maybe it cannot survive without both. But that balance is fragile, and the deeper you look, the more it starts to feel like remembering is dangerous. But it is also the most important thing you can do.